Hey everyone. So we're looking at chapter 19, which is going to kind of conclude really a lot of what we've done this year, but looking at biodiversity and classification. So kind of extending upon what we talked about with evolution in chapters 17 and 18, and looking at exactly, how do we classify and organize all this information about the living things that exist on the planet. Okay. So we're going to talk about things that you've likely heard before, like kingdoms and phyla and classes and domains and families and genus and species. So there should be some familiar terms in here, and I'm hoping that that means good things when it comes to things like tests and quizzes. Okay. So if you'll put down the heading here, section 19.1, finding order in biodiversity. And I should also add, there are only two sections in this chapter. So that means we're really only going to do 19 and 1, 19.1 and 19.2, and then we'll be moving on to something bigger and better and different. Okay. So thinking about biodiversity and how we organize that information, I've got three objectives here as part of this first section. So we're going to look at the goals of what we call binomial nomenclature, taxonomy, and then we're going to talk about a guy named Carolus Linnaeus who helped to describe and group species and organize them into different what we call taxa, or different levels in a taxonomic tree. We're going to identify and talk about just some of the general characteristics of the six kingdoms of life and the three domains into which those are categorized. So kind of a whole bunch of stuff here at the start, but really this is kind of as simple as we can make it when we think about things like classification. Okay. So I mentioned this guy named Linnaeus. Carolus Linnaeus created our current taxonomic system. And what that means is that he helped to devise these levels that you've likely heard before. The term kingdom and phylum, all of that came from Linnaeus's original system, and it's still in use today because it was just, that good. We call this taxonomy. This is the science of naming and classifying organisms. And any individual group, any level in Linnaeus' system is what we call a taxon. So we can talk about a kingdom as being a taxon, or a phylum as being a representative of a taxon, and so on. Now, he created this almost now 300 years ago, 270-ish years ago. And the fact that it's still being used kind of points to how important it's been, right? Its usefulness kind of across the board. So when we think about taxonomy, in reality, how we're organizing things, like how we figure out where to place certain organisms in the system, is based on physical and structural similarities. And sometimes also that will include DNA and genetic information. But we do not classify things in his system based on evolutionary histories or evolutionary relationships. There's a whole different classification system that's been built for that. So when we think about, just how we characterize and name these species, it has nothing to do with really where they came from, but it has everything to do with who they share certain traits in common with. Okay. So, for example, vertebrates are classified in a certain group because they all share backbones, right? And we can branch out from there and become more and more specific about what types of vertebrates we're looking at. But the idea is that they have to share similar physical or structural characteristics, okay? Or even, as I mentioned, genetic information. So, again, organizing based on those physical and structural similarities, we place organisms in his system into different levels of a hierarchy. So every organism that's been identified and named is placed into a domain, a kingdom, a phylum, a class, order, family, genus, and species. And yes, you absolutely should know these, and you should know them in this order. So I would definitely write that down. Among these groups, we tend to think of domain as being the biggest. So it's kind of like a pyramid that's upside down. Domains is really broad and large category, all the way down to species here, where we kind of narrow and come down to one specific type of individual. So domain is the most broad and general in terms of its category. And we're going to get more and more specific as we move down that chain there, down to the species level. So the largest taxon, as I said, the largest level is the domain. The most specific and the smallest taxon or level is the species. Okay. And by definition, if you remember, species are organisms that are similar enough that they can mate and have fertile offspring. All right. So there are lots of examples of living things that are very similar, but because they can't produce offspring, then they're not classified as the same group, as the same species. So they may be the same in this taxonomic system all the way down to even the genus level, but then when we get down to species, they're given a different name. Okay, so as part of the system, the additional piece that he comes up with in devising this taxonomic system is something called binomial nomenclature, which is a bit of a redundant term. So bi, if you remember from Latin roots, means two. Nome, N-O-M, refers to name. So when we think about this term, binomial means to name, and then nomenclature is a naming system. So it's a to-name naming system, which essentially means that for any living thing, they're given a scientific name that consists of two parts. The two parts of the name are comprised of the genus name and the species name. Okay, so humans are called Homo sapiens. So our genus name is Homo, and our species name is Sapien. All right. I'm trying to think. Well, I don't want to go down that road. Fruit flies, for example, we could say fruit flies belong to the genus Drosophila, and they belong to the species name Melanogaster. So there's not, obviously, these are scientific names, and so some of these are a little bit crazy and hard to pronounce and even harder to spell. But that's where we get those scientific terms. So the first part of the name, again, represents the genus name. Genus includes, by definition, one or more physically similar species that we think are actually related, but they have to be very, very similar. Okay. Second part of the name represents the species name. All right. So again, to be called Homo sapiens, again, we are part of genus Homo and species Sapien, right? But there were other types of Homo genus species around, right? There was Homo neanderthalis, which is the Neanderthals, the cavemen. There was Homo erectus, which was the first human that's standing upright, right? And as part of that, right, we had different species. Now, they're not still around, which is why we don't have to try and figure out if we would be able to mate with those individual groups. But we can say that our species, having been so closely related to those, likely belong to the same genus, okay? So here are a couple of other examples. We're looking at two different types of bears. Let me scoot back right there. So a polar bear, for example, belongs to the genus Ursus, and Ursus is the name of really any bear species. So I've got a polar bear there on the left and a grizzly bear there on the right. And we call the polar bear Ursus maritimus because it can swim in the water, and water is a big, big part of its habitat, and ice in general also. So the genus is Ursus, maritimus is the species name. And if a scientist is referring to this in a research paper, they're going to use both parts of that name. Okay, so they're going to talk about the research that they did with Ursus maritimus. All right. Now, in comparison to that, the grizzly bear over here is called Ursus arctos, right? We've got a genus and a species name there. And again, very similar in that they both belong to the same genus, but different enough to where they can't produce offspring if they were to mate. Okay. So if we think about bears in general, okay, we're going down this pathway. We've got domain eukaryote at the top. So we would say bears and all sorts of other eukaryotic organisms belong to this first domain. You can see this is my largest group of examples. As we go a little bit more narrow here, we can say within that first big category of domain, we have four kingdoms. One of those kingdoms includes all the animals, and it's called Kingdom Animalia. And so I'm getting rid of some of these plant, fungi, and protist species here, and now I'm only worried about and concerned with these animals right here. So I go from about 4 to 10 million species to just about 2 million. And then I'm going to go to Chordata, the phylum Chordata, which means you have a backbone. Okay, and if you have a backbone, there's about 50,000 species that have been identified that fit that category. And so all these species here belong to phylum Chordata. Within that backbone category, we have mammals, right? There are other types of organisms that fit that, but mammals are one. Class Mammalia has just mammals, and again, I'm reducing the size of the number of individuals here to about 5,000. Carnivores are those mammals that tend to eat mostly meat, right? And so I've got lots of bears here, and I look like I also have a tiger here as part of it. Ursidae, which has to do with bears. Ursus, which is again bears, and then you've got your species down there at the bottom. So again, as we go down this line, domain to species, we get more and more narrow, right? That's the idea. So when we think about classification in this system that was designed by Linnaeus, classification over time can become more and more complicated. Like when Mendel, excuse me, not Mendel, when Linnaeus devised this system in the 1700s, he really only created kingdoms to include two different groups, plants and animals. And part of the reason for that is we had no concept that there were these tiny microscopic living things, that we had protists that can be tiny. And fungi were kind of categorized as plants, right? And then we didn't know that there were any type of bacteria. What we knew in the 1700s and really for much of the 1800s also is that what we saw, it was what was there, right? What we could see with our eyes is what was actually there. But we know now that there's a lot of other things that are also living and that fit the bill, so to speak, in terms of, characteristics of life. But that, you just can't simply see with your eyes, right? You have to use tools like microscopes. So it wasn't until we get into the 1950s where we create kingdoms here that become more different. So in the 1950s, we introduced this kingdom here that's no longer even present. This is called Kingdom Monera, and Monera consisted of all the bacteria, all the prokaryotes that had been identified on the planet. Well, as we get into the 1990s, Kingdom Monera gets split into two additional kingdoms called Eubacteria and Archaebacteria. And these two are very different. They're different enough that scientists have actually gone through and said, okay, these aren't just different on the kingdom level, these are actually different in a much larger scale. And so they've gone through and actually created a domain. And domain is the newest addition to this system. And it's not shown here in this table, but domain would follow after the 1990s. So much so that when I was in school, there was no such thing as a domain. Right? We learned about kingdoms, and that was it. And Monera was part of the vocabulary that we used at the time. Even though these were introduced in the 90s, textbooks didn't have those in the 90s. So I still learned about Monera when I was in ninth grade biology. So Eubacteria, Archaebacteria are fairly new. These are now specific domains, as is a domain called Eukarya. So in total, there are 3 domains. We have Eukarya, which includes all eukaryotes. Remember, those are cells that have membrane-bound organelles and are generally, they can be single or multicellular. They have nuclei. And then archaea and bacteria, or what we called here Archaebacteria and Eubacteria, are the other 2 domains, and they consist together of all the prokaryotes on the planet. But again, they're so different from one another that they've kind of tried to emphasize this in creating this whole new level of domain to show how different they are. So all living things in that case can fit into one of these 3 domains. Within that Eukarya domain, we have 4 kingdoms. So we have Animalia, Plantae, Fungi, and Protista. And then within the Archaea domain, we have Kingdom Archaea. And then within the Eubacteria domain, we have Eubacteria. So those are easy because it's just what's here in the domain level is also the same name as the kingdom. But the Eukarya one is slightly different. Okay, you should definitely know the names of the domains and the names of the kingdoms that fit in those. All right, let me scoop myself over a little bit here. Okay, so here's our current system. All right, so we've got our 3 domains listed across the top: Bacteria, Archaea, and Eukarya. The kingdoms that fall into each of those categories are listed below them. So bacteria consists of all Eubacteria, Archaea consists of all Archaebacteria, and Eukarya consists of all protists, fungi, plants, and animals. You can see here we're also including things like cell type. So here are your prokaryotes on the left, eukaryotes are here on the right. Cell structures, number of cells, and so on. Okay, this would be a great thing to jot down or have on hand when you get to a quiz or a test if you're allowed to use notes. And use these examples, use the information about how they obtain energy, if they're auto or heterotrophs, to help you kind of distinguish between what fits into each of these categories. Okay. So speaking of some of these things, first of all, I need to kind of reiterate what makes these things so different. So I mentioned that they are super different, even though they are just single-celled, simple prokaryotes. What makes them so different? Domain bacteria is going to be all those bacteria that we tend to see and hear and talk about maybe not so much on a daily basis. I know you don't often talk about bacteria, but the bacteria that we interact with on a daily basis. So the stuff that we find on our hands and on our tables and on our laptops, and the stuff that can sometimes make you sick, like the bacteria that causes strep throat or pneumonia. All of those are what we call regular old bacteria, and they fit into domain bacteria and kingdom bacteria. Okay. Archaea, on the other hand, are what we call archaebacteria. Remember, archae was a Latin root and it meant ancient. These are bacterial cells and prokaryotes that have the ability to survive in really, really extreme environments. Places for centuries that we as humans had thought nothing could ever exist. Like there was no way a living thing could be found in in the Dead Sea, right? I mean, it's called the Dead Sea for a reason. The Dead Sea itself is super salty, and it's so salty, in fact, that most living things aren't there. Like we don't have fish that thrive there. We don't have seaweed that grows in the Dead Sea. For all intents and purposes, most people thought it was just dead, and couldn't support living things. We'll come to find out there's a whole group of archaebacteria that survive really well in the Dead Sea, and they're called halophiles because they just love salt. And so they survive well in that environment. We also have archaebacteria that live and thrive in volcanic vents and geysers and thermal vents and other places where we have super hot water. And those are called thermophilic bacteria, and they love super hot environments. And they have adaptations that allow them to survive in those really kind of extreme conditions. So again, bacteria and archaea, though they're both prokaryotes, they have some unique traits that allow them to survive in different places. If you took regular old bacteria from domain bacteria and put them into a volcanic vent, they're not going to survive. Similarly, if you take the archaebacteria and put them maybe on your hand, it's not going to survive as well as it would under those kind of extreme conditions. So we like to call archaea or archaebacteria extremophiles because they love crazy extreme environments. Okay, and that's what they're built to kind of live within. Within domain eukarya, we have two kingdoms, actually four, but here are the first two, protists and fungi. And protists are put in quotation marks here because it's not that it's not a real thing, but protists are kind of an interesting category. It's basically everything that we can't fit into fungi, animals, or plants. They all kind of get lumped into protists. And so within that protist kingdom, we have like three different major types. We have plant-like protists that are photosynthetic, like these. We have animal-like protists that are not photosynthetic, that are heterotrophic, that have to eat to obtain their food, like amoeba. And then we have fungus-like protists that, again, are also consumers and heterotrophs. They cannot make their own food, but they function an awful lot like fungi would, like this mushroom you see right here, right? That's actually part of kingdom fungi, but you can have some protists that are similar in terms of behavior and structures. So protists can be single-celled, they can be multicellular. What they share in common, again, is that they just generally don't fit any other category. So they kind of get thrown in this last one by themselves. They are all eukaryotes because they are part of domain eukarya. Okay. Fungi, as I mentioned, are consumers. They're heterotrophs. They do not do photosynthesis. That's kind of a misconception that people think about because, I mean, you notice how colorful some of these things are. But when we talk about fungi, they are consumers. So they have to have something available to consume as energy. So yeast, for example, if you're going to go make bread, you have to add sugar to the solution that you're going to put the yeast in. If you don't add sugar, they don't create energy. They're not active. They won't cause bread to actually start to rise, okay, and release that CO2. Fungi are the same way. If they don't have access to dead materials and things that they can decompose, they're not going to grow very well either. So generally, fungi tend to be decomposers, and they're really helpful in environments for breaking things down. But they are, again, heterotrophs. They're consumers, not producers. Plants and animals, so this is kingdoms Plantae and kingdom Animalia, also eukaryotes, right? We all know what plants and animals are, I would hope. So plants, photosynthetic, they're autotrophic, they make their own energy. Animals are very different from that, right? They do not make their own energy. They are consumers and heterotrophs, and they have to obtain energy from consuming other organisms, okay? So that's all I've got here for section 19.1. So you're going to spend some time going through these domains and kingdoms a little bit more specifically, kind of on your own. and then we'll come back and look at 19.2. All right. If you've got any questions, as always, let me know. Otherwise, I will see you next time. Bye, y'all.